That's still the long-term vision for smart commodities and where we see the world headed in commodities to add more, whether it's the environmental footprint or some of the issues that are now they're driving a lot of geopolitics. Think more information in supply chains and more real-time information in supply chains rather than just passing on lots of spreadsheets and emails are a little bit better than fax machines, but they're not to the real-time data analysis that the rest of the world's moving.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome to our Smarter Markets Holiday Special 2024. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abaxx Technologies. Our guest today is Josh Crumb, founder and CEO of Abaxx Technologies. He's joined by our colleagues Sacha Lifschitz, David Gornall, and Steve Lowe. This year we're talking metals markets, battery metals and gold. We'll be discussing our Smarter Markets vision for the metals markets and how better market infrastructure and financial technology can be brought to bear to make these markets fit for purpose for today's commercial needs and tomorrow's. Hello, Josh. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hi, Dave.
It's our traditional holiday sit-down with you here on the podcast to discuss where we've been and where we're going in this journey to build smarter markets. And this year, we're talking about the markets where your career began, the metals markets. And we're joined by three of our Abaxx colleagues who, between them, have spent many decades, can I say near a century, trading and working in base and precious metals markets. And that, of course, is Sacha Lifschitz, David Gornall, and Steve Lowe. And as I said, Josh, you grew up career-wise in the metals markets, and you experienced firsthand many of the real commercial problems and challenges created by not having access to the right market infrastructure, by not having access to the right tools, and not having the right technology. So I thought maybe you could start us off today telling us a bit about that formative experience you had in the metals markets and how it shaped your vision for Abaxx.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Look, this is a very exciting time because, I know a lot of market participants and investors know Abaxx for liquefied natural gas and the things that we're looking to do in the global energy market and the global energy transition with environmental markets. But the first quarter of next year, we're ready to start to roll out our three first metals markets. And these all three were sort of penciled into the original Abaxx sort of vision back in 2018, 2019. That being lithium, nickel, and gold. So we can obviously get into all of those products more with experts, from trading and financial markets, far beyond my own. I'm happy to talk through. I am a mining engineer by background. I think in probably some of the previous episodes, we talked about a little bit where I first really got to learn about market infrastructure. It really started with a big hedging program when I was part of a mining company in North America. And coming out of the financial crisis, we were required by our banking partners to put on a fairly substantial hedging program. And what's the term in the industry? I think we got our face ripped off, I think how they say it. And so it obviously, just being that engineer that's always asking why, you kind of have to deconstruct the whole thing to understand what led us to that point in time. What is it about the market structure, financial intermediaries? What kind of led us to that point? So I think that was always a vision, and it was really catalyzed me to really understand the futures and derivatives markets and risk management at a very deep level when you have, that type of an experience. And I think that's in some ways where it all started, coming out of kind of the last commodity cycle when I was working with, you and Jeff Curry and the team in Goldman. After I left Goldman, kind of after that cycle, it was thinking about how do we apply financial technology? How can we apply some of the things that are happening and all of this software innovation to maybe make these markets a little better? So yeah, it all kind of started with metals. And now, again, even though if you think about energy markets in a derivative and future standpoint, the NYMEX purchased the COMEX, and in many ways became a subsidiary of the energy markets. And the energy markets, I think, are sort of orders of magnitude the size and scale. But if you look at the world we're headed into, I think Jeff Curry calls it the, 4 Ds with decarbonization, the disaggregated supply chains, data centers. I don't know. I think I'm throwing them off. I think that I've counted like 6 Ds. You got de-dollarization. There's many, and I think I'm forgetting two of Jeff's. But metals really play a key role in all of these. We think about the growth of a metals market, it needs risk management. It needs a forward long-term view. It's not quick or easy to build anything in the metals market from an infrastructure perspective, whether we're talking about physical infrastructure, we're talking about market infrastructure. These things take a long time. So we have to get started. That's an overview and happy to have you take it forward.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, heading into 2025, you'll be rolling out nickel, lithium, and gold futures markets at Abaxx Exchange, and that those have been on your list for a long time now, kind of going back to the beginning of your work on Abaxx. And I wanted to ask you, why those in particular? Why were those on your list?
I think it's just identifying where there's a lack of market infrastructure or a market infrastructure that can change as the world is changing. When I think about nickel, and obviously, Sasha and I can talk a lot about this. I mean, Sasha and I have been talking about some of the problems in the nickel market for well over a decade, maybe 15 years when we first met. So there's always been some challenges in the nickel market compared to, say, other LME markets and the way they're structured. And you've got multiple sort of supply chains relying on a nickel unit, but consuming different nickel products. So nickel was always one that we thought there could be some more work. Lithium was key just because if you look at the dramatic growth, the requirements of the lithium industry and the fact that there really was no, and still, and I would argue, outside of some of the price assessments, there really isn't a lot of market infrastructure for standardizing and risk management in lithium. So that was obviously a key one to go alongside nickel and battery metals. Gold, it's really, I think, just the way that the market and the macro market's moving, the consumption centers are moving, and some of the problems that we already had a split market between, spot over the counter markets and LBMA and futures markets on COMEX. And then, of course, some of the capital control issues and financial control issues in major markets like India and China. So gold has always had, despite being a very, very old commodity, you'd think market infrastructure is pretty well developed. But I feel like there's always new cases to expand on the gold market and upgrade the gold market. That was kind of the reason for those three. And of course, the one other one that Robert Friedland will always remind us of is green premiums in copper and other base metals that are important to the energy transition. So don't worry, Robert, those are still on our list. And I think we'll make some substantial progress next year as well in smart commodities and what we want to do in the other base metals. But really, it was those three, for those kind of three reasons that we were focused on getting up and running with our metals business.
Let's bring Sacha into the conversation. You mentioned that you've known each other for close to 15 years at this point. Maybe I'll ask Sacha his perspective. Sacha, how did you and Josh first get to know each other?
Business wise, there's actually a nice story business wise and an equally nice story privately. Business wise, we got to know each other through my times when I was working Glencore in the early to mid 2000s, when we were negotiating offtake agreements for Lundin Mining's Rio Narcea nickel and copper mine in Spain. And we eventually negotiated the offtake agreement. That's how we met. And the first personal encounter then really was shortly, I think, after we've signed that contract, when we met at one of the nice LME lunches with a bit of booze and good food in one of the obvious locations in Mayfair, London. And we really hit it off, I think, if I may say, from the very first moment, and always also stayed in contact afterwards. Eventually, the offtake rolled out and we lost contact on the back of the business. Josh left also to pursue other careers at Goldman and wherever. And then eventually we just never lost contact, and LinkedIn and the likes make it very easy, to just follow up. And that's basically how we met. And then like 2.5 years ago, when Josh called me and said, listen, I could need some help on nickel and explain what we do in Abaxx, it was an obvious move for me joining this tremendous team.
As you said, Sacha, you spent a large part of your career trading nickel at Glencore, and now you've really been instrumental in launching a new suite of battery metals contracts, including nickel sulfate and lithium, that'll be rolling out in the new year. And I wanted to ask you, when you take a step back, how have these metals markets been growing and evolving and changing over the course of your career?
Look, I mean, these markets, obviously, everybody who's listening to this podcast regularly and is involved in our metals and commodity markets, everybody knows how tremendously they've changed. I started my career at the beginning of 1999, so 25 years in the industry. Started as a small nickel trader on a small nickel desk at Glencore at that time, when it was really all about having small off takes, a bit of trading, canceling a couple of warrants. And then it quickly in the 2000s, obviously with the growth of China and this insatiable appetite for commodities, you couldn't be big enough. So you grow into big own production. You start doing the big arbitrage games. Intermediate flows eventually became to play a very important role, specifically in the nickel market, which wasn't the case before because it's predominantly, producer consumer business and quite integrated to the business as such. At that time, it really was the role of the traders, I would say, playing this buyer and sell of last resort and guaranteeing financial flows to the producers, through offtake agreements. And this really now, this role of buyer and sell of last resort, that's something we try to create now with our new products of nickel sulfate and lithium carbonate. And I'm sure we're going to touch on this a bit more in detail later on. But just to stay in this whole context and this narrative, the taking advantage of information, this was obviously one of the big games of the traders. And that again now has disappeared now with the artificial intelligence and the general flow of information. Everybody has the information at the same time. So tremendous change on the nickel side. I think when we talk about lithium, that's something obviously we've all witnessed the bit of a later stage. This really started becoming, a household name with the evolvement of the battery materials. And what I would see and witness here is, and that's also playing into our hands as what we're creating as Abaxx, is that it used to become obviously a producer-consumer business, let's say maybe 5-10 years ago, and now slowly gets into the stage where it's maturing, where traders get involved, where exchanges get involved, where exchanges like Abaxx start creating contracts that haven't existed so far. This whole role of buyer and seller of last resort with the physical deliverable aspect of the product, the standardization of the products, where we think actually even on lithium carbonate, we can maybe play an active role in doing that by creating our exchange contracts. So yeah, I could go on forever, but let me stop here. It's been amazing how these markets change and evolve, and it's equally satisfactory for me to play a part in this by working with this tremendous team at Abaxx.
Yeah, and I wanted to have you go a little more. Sticking with lithium, I think there's one of the things that always strikes me is the difference of trading or operating in an existing market versus trying to build a new market and that transformation of getting it off the ground. And I'm curious, like for lithium, as Josh said, like it's kind of a new market. It's been a very physical market. Like there hasn't been a lot of futures derivatives for risk management. Most of them, new or cash settled. And so what are the challenges you've seen talking with traders who might be used to purely physical trading to begin that shift in mindset and operations to trade futures? And what are the opportunities that futures will make available to them?
Yeah, look, I think on the lithium side, as I just already said earlier, this is really a maturing market. And up until really a few, I would say months ago, maybe on intermediates and maybe a few years ago on spodumene, or let's say really the base product, this is really a market which just starts evolving as becoming a mature market where trading and intermediate players start, and even financial players start playing a more important role or bigger role in this. Up until a few months or a few years ago, it was really just directly producer to consumer business. And I think the main challenge here is really to convince all participants in the market that there's not only a physical aspect, but there's also a future aspect. And some of the traders or some of the people who are involved in these companies obviously have a background of other commodities where they're familiar with future markets. But also some of these players, they really have very limited experience, have had very limited experience with the future markets. And I think the challenge here is really to explain where the similarities is and where the differences are. And to really explain this, what's happening when you just enter into a futures position, and then at the convergence between the future and the physical side with our direct delivery mechanism, what's happening then, and where the future position transfers into a physical position. So we spend a lot of time explaining that and think it's really key to make these contracts, which we're developing, a success by sometimes even holding the hands, of some of the participants and explaining what we're doing. But the good thing is other battery materials like nickel, or there's a history there of future businesses, obviously through the LME with metal, not the same underlying product. We can profit from that experience, which is in the community.
Just jump in for a second. I think it's also important to understand, of course, that lithium, has really been a specialty chemical market in the batteries and so forth. So when we think about commodities more broadly, and particularly the metals, which in a lot of its simplest form is sort of pure elemental bars or cathodes and so forth, I think that's the other part. In fact, when we originally started Abaxx, I actually had penciled in spodumene was really going to be the commodity of the supply chain. But ultimately, I think that really started to change over the last year or two, particularly as lithium carbonate has moved to a lot more standardization and really is starting to emerge as a potential commodity. Now, that said, we still have price assessments that are really kind of all over the map sometimes at the same time for what the price of carbonate is inside and outside of China. And the way that these assessments always tend to play off of each other reflexively, even though the markets may be very different. I think what we're so excited about is allowing this actual buyer and seller of last resort physical price to emerge. Maybe I'm cutting ahead in your questions, but I think it's important to understand that lithium has not been a commodity, and certainly not like the other metal commodities, and really been much more of a specialty chemical market.
That's such a great point. And you also brought up what's happening in China versus outside China. And I wanted to ask you, Sacha, obviously there's been such a transformation in these specialty chemical / metals markets with the rise in the need for the components for battery metals. And there's been a big shift in the underlying physical market in nickel in particular. So with Indonesia and China dominating production in a really unprecedented way. I mean, if you look in the oil market, everyone talks about OPEC, and OPEC 10 is, maybe 10%ers, give or take, of the oil market. Indonesia and China are 60, 70% of the nickel market. How is that changing the nature of the nickel trade and how a trader operates in the nickel market?
Look, I mean, I think the big change in how trading worked in the nickel space, that really started off in the early 2000s, when China initially became just a huge importer, hoovering up basically all the commodities around the world. And that doesn't only go for nickel, that obviously applies to all the other base metal and commodities. I think the one major shift I've witnessed, and I think we've all witnessed, is really, let's say, that started like in 2006, 2007, when China started buying up these mines in Indonesia and basically became, from one of the biggest consumers of nickel, also one of the biggest producers of nickel. Obviously, at that time, they were opening mines and just exporting the ore to China, producing nickel pig iron. But very quickly, they realized that the biggest money is in the value chain. And they started not only producing nickel pig iron, but also up until the end product, stainless steel in China. So building up stainless steel factories and transferring the nickel already on the island. Then obviously as a next step, as the electricity, EV, the whole battery and EV story started to emerge, they moved even further and not only producing only nickel pig iron and stainless steel, but now producing mixed hydroxide, nickel sulfate, and those products needed for the battery production and energy transition. And the trend again, here continued, where they start fully integrating the supply chain from nickel ore to the end product, now being a battery. And in my view, it's not only Indonesia or China now, it's basically one big region, right? Indonesia / China, where you have integrated supply chains and ever growing trade between those countries, but also production in those countries. So the dominance of Indonesia, China is there and is apparent. And I think the one big topic, obviously, when Josh and the team started thinking about what could we do in the nickel space, and then also when we really sat down and developed those nickel sulfate contracts, which we have developed, is also realizing that there is an edge where a smaller and smaller proportion of nickel units in our industry are metals which are dominated through the LME and priced through the LME. So there we clearly saw an interest and a need of creating a smarter market in a way of having a better benchmark product, also physically deliverable and not only as a pure cash settled contract or just a futures contract. So that's really how we see this nickel market evolving, and that's also the result. And the result of this is products we launch in the physically deliverable nickel contract.
I want to ask both you and Josh, maybe I'll start with Josh. When you look at the nickel sulfate and lithium contracts that are being introduced at Abaxx, they're innovative in that they're physically deliverable, but without a warehouse system. And Josh, I'm thinking back to earlier in the conversation with some of your experiences, and there have been problems in the warehousing system with the LME for quite some time. And then you add on the top of that, as you said, nickel sulfate, lithium, some of these are more specialty chemicals than classic metals. They don't necessarily sit on the shelf the way a bar of copper would. So when you think about that, maybe I'll start with Josh. How do you think about moving into a set of contracts for the metals markets where you don't have a warehouse system?
It's something we've debated a lot internally and with clients. And I actually remember at Goldman, we wrote a long report on the warehousing system many years ago. Does it really drive the price? What are the differentials from a global warehousing system to actual spot premiums? Look, I think there's a couple things that have changed. With these products specifically, we have to remember that there's not a super long shelf life, right? And so it's not as conducive to stacking in a warehouse as, long shelf life cathode or anode or something like that, right? So right now, I think that's the first part is you really have to think about direct delivery type markets. Now, it's not that these things won't store in some sort of container or port or something. And so I'd say the other part that I think is very different than when complex warranting systems were built many, many decades ago is just the flow of information, right? Having that warranting system was really an information system as much as anything else back when we were moving data around by fax machines and so forth, right? So the fact that real-time information, whether it's a branded warehouse, part of an integrity system like LME or LBMA or COMEX, or if it's any other warehouse, just data and standards just moved so much faster than they used to. So I don't think we necessarily have to have the same structure of warehousing systems that were built in a very different information age. So I think those are really the two pieces where we don't think we have to do things always the same way. I think Tom McMahon, in one of the episodes told a story where in some of the original oil contracts, all they knew was the warehousing system from metals and grains. And so they were trying to do, barrels in a warehouse as the storage system for contracts for oil. So again, these markets evolve really because of information systems, but also just the dynamic need for the market. So look, I think there's still a lot to be said about warehousing closer to demand centers or closer to supply centers, depending on if you've got long, complex supply chains, because commodities, obviously, and particularly some of the metals products are expensive relative to their value to ship around the world a lot, so you don't want to be always rehandling them. But we do think there's room for a new model beyond just the traditional warehouse warranting systems for metals, particularly if they don't have a long shelf life like some of the battery metals.
Let me stick with you for a second, Josh, because also in 2024, Abaxx has been doing an increasing amount of work and partnering with MineHub. And we had Andrea Orengren on the podcast a little bit earlier in the year. And when you bring up kind of the evolving information systems in the metals markets, how that can change the way they trade, how do you think about the partnership with MineHub?
Two things, right? I think just one and just optimization, having a more central logistics hub for the market to be, relying on, I think helps with a lot of optimization, right? The cheapest cost for shipping of a metal is a metal that doesn't have to be shipped or it doesn't have to be rehandled. So, the more information that market participants can have for various swaps or trades in transit to optimize the shipping, that obviously, saves on carbon footprint, it saves on cost, it saves on time. I think having that information in the market beyond just when it hits a warehouse, but when it's actually in transit in various forms, I think is going to be very good information for the market. And look, it's just like any other market. As information systems advance, you're going to see more and more complexity of the trade. That's always been the case. That's one part of it. I'd say the second part that's very interesting for us is, of course, the what we talked about a lot about last year's, sort of Christmas episode and around smart commodities, being able to have, in some ways, decommoditize commodities by having a lot more origin information in the commodity. And so this is, of course, a system for tracking and tracing that eventually, combined with some of the Abaxx technologies, can help solve some of those problems of keeping origin material data all the way through a supply chain, but at the same time, not disadvantaging any one participant, whether it's the middle or the beginning, of sharing too much data, right? Persistent data, but data on a need to know basis. That's still the long term vision for smart commodities and where we see the world headed in commodities, to add more, whether it's the environmental footprint or some of the issues that are now they're driving a lot of geopolitics. Think more information in supply chains and more real time information in supply chains rather than just passing on lots of spreadsheets and emails are a little bit better than fax machines, but they're not to the real time data analysis that the rest of the world's moving. So MineHub was definitely a first step in doing that. So again, we don't have to be so reliant on a single warehousing system.
And let me come back to you, Sacha, because with contracts that are physically deliverable but without a warehouse system, that's new in the metal side. So I was hoping you might take a few minutes and walk through how does that work and how big a change do you think that is for metals traders?
It is a changing concept, but also at the same time, it's a concept that's familiar to physical trading companies or to producers and consumers alike. We do need to do a bit of work on getting the people to rethink the concept. And it's actually been fun. We've been creating these contracts over the last, and in the case of nickel, over the last bit more than 2 years, lithium a bit more than 1 year. And as from the very beginning, we had this idea about having a DAP contract delivered place instead of delivering the material in a warehouse in the form of warrants, like most of the people are familiar with in the metals industry, because that's what the LME applies. And the funny thing really is people always ask us what's the delivery term, and we still get the same questions today because somewhere in their minds, people think when they think about having futures and the delivery mechanism of futures for them, the concept says there needs to be a warehouse somewhere. And that's exactly what we want to change. And I think the big benefit from it is really it's making the whole delivery mechanism a lot easier for everybody involved. And when you think about a producer who sells their product, or if you think about a trading company who picks up the material somewhere and delivers it to another place to the consumer, all they do is putting together the set of documents, including a title document like a BL and all the certificates. Everything is exactly the same as if somebody would have a physical sale and purchase of commodities. The only thing is that it doesn't have to go into a warehouse. It doesn't need to go on warrant. And then people have to cancel warrants and people have problems with queues and waiting until they can get delivery. So all the pitfalls we have with an LME system. So we're avoiding all that, but just matching buyers and sellers at a destination. In this case of our Singapore contract, obviously is Singapore. In lithium, we're going to launch same time Rotterdam, Baltimore, and Singapore. So they're going to trade 3 different contracts and you know exactly where you get your material. In the case of nickel sulfate, we launch with Singapore and we're going to hopefully extend that product range quickly to Rotterdam and Baltimore too. So the big difference here is also you know where you get your warrant. Actually, you don't get your warrant, but you know where you get your material. That's really another huge advantage of knowing exactly where you have to deliver your material and where you pick up your material. So in my view, it's a bit of a change in mindset and people have to just walk through that process once, but then everybody will understand that it's actually a lot closer to how physical metal is traded and bought and sold between a producer and the consumer than anything else. So once you walk people through that concept, everybody says, okay, you know what, now I get it.
I want to make sure that we're able to talk about the third metal on the list, which is gold. But, now, Josh, that you've kind of are in the process of crossing off the first 2 items on your list, nickel and lithium, with the launch of the battery metals contracts as we roll into the new year, I wanted to ask you, what's next on your list on that side? What are the next steps you have in mind for further development of these battery metals markets and the wider base metals markets?
Well, again, I think it comes back to starting with where's there a real need. right? And first couple had very specific needs in the market. And I would say when we think about some of the other base metals, I think the contracts that exist are very liquid. I think there's pretty good coverage of something, say, like copper between COMEX, LME, and the Shanghai Futures Exchange. So I don't think the core of the contract is necessarily of a copper cathode is exactly what the market's needing. But that said, I think it's again, it's things like origin material and green premium. It's things like potential, more crude or post-refined products. Maybe they won't gather the same type of liquidity as the elemental contract, but certainly is there a need for price discovery beyond just various survey indexes for things like we're thinking about things like scrap or concentrate or other parts of the supply chain. Now, again, this isn't simple. There's a lot more complexity than an elemental market, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be always challenging to find parts of enough buyers and enough sellers to really find true price discovery within some sort of common terms of trade. There's aspects beyond the cathode that we're looking at. And of course, we're looking at like origin material type premiums and the data that's going to be required for those types of markets beyond just the supply and demand. How do you gather the data and create enough data to create those types of pricings?
I want to make sure we get to the third item on the list, which is gold. So let's talk there. Josh, if I recall correctly, your first deep dive into the frontiers of financial technology that would become central to Abaxx was in the gold market. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that experience and how it influenced your thinking on the role of financial technology in these markets.
Sure, absolutely. So, this is the point in the podcast where I tell my origin story of first reading the Satoshi white paper, which is very common in most crypto podcasts. And of course, we're not a crypto company, but I think I jumped right away to this concept of sort of triple entry accounting and how triple enter accounting of a decentralized ledger and more importantly, a decentralized data store where data could be persistent and unchangeable and how that would help something like an inventory system that the whole market is sharing. Obviously, I'm not the first person. I mean, lots of people jump to that conclusion. To start, we very quickly thought, well, gold is going to be the one that makes the most sense because of its being so globally common in the vaulting systems. So, very quickly, me and some of my original business partners wrote our first patents on blockchain and gold in I think 2013. We're beyond a decade beyond. And that said, there's still not a lot of that technology being used in the real wholesale B2B commercial markets for metals. I mean, sure, there's a little bit of stuff happening, trading in DeFi and so-called stable coins backed by gold, but not really in a globally trusted system. And there's been many attempts to do that. So that's really where it all started. I would also add that some of our former colleagues at Goldman, even after I had left, kind of called me back in. I remember there was a period like almost every few weeks I was sitting in Jeff Curry's office talking about Bitcoin, right? And all of the comparisons between Bitcoin and gold. And I even, had the opportunity to go out and meet George Soros, legendary currency trader, talking about Bitcoin and Bitcoin versus gold. So definitely a lot of time in those discussions. But I think, with gold, what a lot of people miss, I mean, we get a lot of information around the financial use case of gold, but I think we forget the fundamentals of why gold has that use case in finance to begin with, right? This wasn't, we just had this collective belief in gold as money. With every commodity, it starts with really four key first principles to the commodity. It's the marginal cost of production, it's the marginal utility and its consumption, it's the cost of storage or the carry of the metal, and then the cost to transport or where the supply demand is. Those are the four fundamentals of a commodity, sort of everywhere and always. And if we look at something like the gold market, it didn't become money because people liked it in jewelry. It didn't become money just because it was shiny and all this, but it had those commodity properties that it's got a very high marginal cost of production, pretty much the highest of any commodity because of its relative scarcity. So it takes a lot of energy to extract. So it's always going to have a first principle marginal cost based on a very, very high energy cost. Until we solve free energy, you're just never going to change that. That cost structure is there. But the marginal utility is not just keeping gold in a vault in the financial system. The marginal utility is jewelry, and not just because it's shiny. I also started a technology jewelry company in the past, co-founded, and you put a 24 karat pure gold bracelet next to anything in 18 or 14 carats, it's a dramatically different product. So you can't just fake gold. Gold in jewelry is one of a kind. And there's a couple properties beyond its shine. It's also very easy to scrap and recycle, which means there's a trade-in cost that's very low. And so it really is a perfect metal. And then also, if you think about why are people gifting, and using jewelry, there's a lot of things, right? There's identity signaling and wealth aspiration. There's a gift of, remembering a loved one or a memory. And that plays into gold's property of never oxidizing or changing or corroding, right? So ultimately, why am I going on about jewelry? There's always a next billion people of aspirational wealth that their first step in wealth is generally jewelry. That's not confined to any one culture or one continent. So it becomes very good warehouse material as money because there's always a marginal utility and a marginal demand of a next billion people demanding the commodity. Obviously, there's going to be periods where financial flows overwhelm the jewelry market, always, right? Whether it's the supply or the demand side overwhelms it. We have periods of high financial demand and jewelry gets crowded out. You build up a lot more financial inventory, and there may be periods where real interest rates go a certain way and you get a lot of destocking of financial, like in the late 90s. So of course, the stocking and destocking of financial inventory can change the market, but the fundamental long-term market and the store of value comes from the marginal cost of production being extremely high and always having a marginal demand and utility in the jewelry market, and then a very low cost of storage, which makes it good money because you don't have a lot of decay or a lot of carry on the inventory. So anyways, I went through that whole thing because I think there's a lot of bad information in the gold market, and you always have to come back to those first principles to understand what does the market actually need.
We hope you enjoyed the first half of our special holiday conversation with Josh Crumb, founder and CEO of Abaxx Technologies, and our colleagues Sacha Lifschitz, David Gornall, and Steve Lowe. We'll continue the conversation next week in part 2 of our holiday special 2024. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abaxx.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abaxx. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abaxx Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.